I try to relate everything I read to painting, how I can use it as a painter. And one of the several things I wanted to talk to you about is when Aristotle talks about the highest good, that for which you do it not for any other reason. And so if you should tie it up to something that is concrete and has to do with painting, it is that you learn anatomy, you learn color, you learn all these things not for their own sake, but to tell a story.
Yeah.
So I think it's the Nicomachean Ethics is really a book to read, no matter what you're working with, because he is so good at clarifying or telling you that you should clarify your value, your values, right? Your value hierarchy. And well, how is it? Isn't that how he talks about wisdom, to know what is good for yourself, right?
Yeah, I mean, so he has this idea of virtues, that all good and right actions come from virtues, which is a character trait. So it's a disposition or an attitude that you have, and it's about responding right in the right context, and that needs cultivation, training, and experience. So wisdom is his understanding of the kind of knowledge you have of both the theoretical scientific aspect and the practical creational aspect. So when you have, and also
the point of doing it and how you do it.
But also making good judgments. So when you make a good judgment, you can be good or bad at making judgments, but you can be very intelligent, for example, and be terrible at making some judgments about the good for you.
Or acting upon the judgment.
So he mentions some pre-Socratic philosophers, and he says they're very smart and so on, but they make terrible judgments. And so he distinguishes these different notions. And I think in contemporary terms, we can think of the difference between being wise, in the sense that you make good judgments, you have the knowledge of how, you have the knowledge of why, and that needs experience. And you can be wise without being, for example, very quick and intelligent. And you can be quick and intelligent without being very wise, because you're young and eager, for example.
So that's a distinction. Maybe I'm too young and eager, but that's a distinction I have a bit of trouble understanding.
So imagine a 20-year-old, very smart mathematician. He's very quick, he captures patterns easily, he's very intelligent, he solves problems quickly. But then you ask him about some life choice, and he has no experience, and he makes a terrible decision.
So the opposite.
So he will be intelligent, but not so wise.
Okay,
And then you can ask an old man who's lived long, experienced a lot, and he tells you what to do with your life in a very, that's a wise and reasonable way, and good judgment. But he's not very quick anymore, and he's not super intelligent anymore. So you can see that the concepts doesn't match up perfectly.
Right.
But ideally, for Aristotle, you would have both, of course.
And what I find fascinating is that he ties this up to emotions. That's a fantastic thing. I mean, Ayn Rand, of course, talks about the same thing, and how you can judge by your emotions if the action is good or not. But of course, your emotions, what you are taught as good or bad, can be perverted, so that you feel pain in doing something that is long-term, has long-term benefit for you. Oh, I have to work hard. Oh no, I don't like that, so I refrain from it. And you like being lazy because you've been taught to enjoy that. And I think that's so it's not just saying that if you feel good, then it's the right choice for you. You have to really evaluate the consequences of the action.
I think the way he uses pain and pleasure is.
It's like in the Poetics. It's like in the Poetics, pain and pleasure.
I think he uses conditioning. So to achieve virtue. So in order to live a good life, a happy life, this eudaimonia, as he calls it, which is the ultimate good, you need to be conditioned and trained and experienced. And one means of conditioning people to do the right thing is by pain and pleasure. So you teach children, for example, that if you do the right thing, you get a sort of pleasure, and if you do the wrong thing, you get a sort of pain. At least they did back then. Smack them if they did something wrong. But then you condition them to do the right thing. So being raised and cultivated this is the old expression. It demands a village to raise a child, and this is very Aristotelian.
For Hillary Clinton, it takes a villain.
It takes a villain to raise a child. But it's like cultivating a plant, basically. So you cultivate the human by giving it the right circumstances. You need some wealth, you need some people around you to experience, you need to see some good, some bad, and you cultivate yourself and condition yourself as a human towards the good life. That's the ideal.
And that ties back to the first conversation we ever had about there are certain objective values or principles when it comes to achieving what is good.
Yeah, so for Aristotle, the eudaimonia, which is the ultimate good everything strives towards for its own sake. It's not for a means to something else, but that's it. That's what you want, that kind of state. And that is something objective, I think, in Aristotle. It's not like a subjective state of happiness. It's an objective state where you as a human have flourished and become the most of what you can become as a human. That's when you reach that state. You cultivate the virtues, the goodness in you, and the skills, and you become the best human you can. That's the kind of state he wants.
Yeah.
So that has to be something objective. It can't just be that we feel that way.
Exactly. So that you're not your feelings. You are. Yeah. There's something that is actually impersonal, objective outside of you that gives you joy or not. I mean, you can feel that. You can try to be happy about something, but you know that it's not really what you are.
I mean, this is a little bit controversial in interpretation of Aristotle, like how subjective, how objective the state of eudaimonia is, this happiness state. But I think it's fairly clear that it's not purely subjective. There's some objective feature to it that you have to reach. You can't just feel yourself there. And I think the feelings and emotions are more means and conditionings to get there rather than the state to get to.
Exactly. Yeah. But how does that differ? Because he talks about things. What words does he use? It's what's it called? Frivillig, ufrivillig.
Voluntarily, involuntarily actions.
Actions, yeah. And the voluntary actions are. Then you have an inner drive, which is not understood as some subjectivistic idea, but you have internalized certain objective principles according to which you act, and then you can go through something that is painful in the short term to achieve something better in the long term.
That's the marshmallows test.
Yeah, exactly. But then that was interesting. You have the involuntary acts where you are driven by outer forces, and then it's a kind of force. Now, I don't think that by then means that, oh no, I couldn't do anything, the society forced me to do it. But it's a question of, are your values integrated in you? Have you thought through them and evaluated them objectively? Do they lead you to the goal that you want or not? And if you follow them, you can follow them in times where it's not socially preferable or it doesn't pay off. I mean, this is also what Nietzsche is talking about, right? You have to go beyond punishment or reward. And you don't even do it for the sake of virtue, you just do it because it benefits you for the goal that you're getting to. And I think a lot of figurative painters need to, and people in general need to really think about that, because there's so many who then see, oh no, I'm not getting paid, literally not getting paid. And then they start adjusting.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's about cultivation of the human being. I mean, so the voluntary actions have according to Aristotle, have their starting point in you. So when an action of mine is voluntary, it's because I started it. I made it happen. And if I'm too conditioned by external things, it's involuntary, really. It's not up to me because I haven't integrated it. So in order to do the right thing, the virtue thing, I need to have the right mental state, I need to have the right motivation, I need to have been cultivated right experience, I need to have the right knowledge. It's a whole package deal.
And you need to know why this is good.
I should know why it's good, I should know the reasons why I'm doing it, it should all come from me. That's when it's voluntary.
But it's not, I mean, this is quite important to distinguish, because it's not just from you. I mean, it's how do you differ it from just being subjectivistic? I just mentioned this thing about internalizing objective values, but I guess that's the answer then.
Well, in a sense, you can trace the causes back to society and cultivation and everything.
Yeah, because you learn from external. You learn from we learn from Aristotle, we learn from Rembrandt, we learn from that's external. But
you take that in, and then you use it, you train, you realize what's good and right, and you get an experience of that, and then you get a certain pleasure from knowing that it's right. And then when I do something around the next corner, I initiate the action because of all that old experience.
And you see that it actually works.
Yeah, and I initiate it for the right reasons, then it's voluntary.
Yeah. So it's not...
But this is a bit... No, it's not crystal clear in the book.
No, but,
I think that's the idea. Yeah.
I think so too, because it's not just, I invented this idea and then therefore it's good.
It's cultivation, so it's training, it's experience, it's based on a bunch of stuff. Yeah. And then I do it for the right reasons in a way. Yeah. And it's actually also in accordance with the virtues, like the good character traits that the good people have. When it's in accordance with that, and in virtue of that I do something, that's when you do the right thing, and that's when it's voluntary. Yeah. So you have to remember that the starting point of the book, the first sentence, is that everything we do is striving for something good. Yeah. That's the first sentence of the book. And in the Metaphysics, another book of Aristotle, he says the first sentence is that we humans, by nature seek knowledge. So that's another sentence in the Metaphysics. And if you combine those two, you get a being like us who seek by nature, we seek knowledge. We seek the truth, to know about the truth. And also everything we do is seeking something good. So if that's how we are, and you define a human, as Aristotle does, as the rational, reasonable thinking creature, then if you want to perfect that and cultivate that, then you need to be the kind of rational, reasonable, acting person who seeks the truth and the good. And when you cultivate that, you get the human. And if you do that right, and you do that in a way that is in accordance with the virtues, the good character traits, and you act because of those virtues, and because you realize that those are the virtues, that's when you start to approach something of a cultivated human that can maybe reach, the state of happiness, eudaimonia.
Yeah, and I think today especially, and this is not just within the so-called art, but the whole idea of being original, being me, and all these things is a major hindrance to benefit from what Aristotle is talking about. Because then it's so self-oriented that you don't look at objective, external, how the reality actually works, and so you lose out on working according to objective principles.
Yeah. So one way of thinking of it is that if I try to do something new and original, I try to do something that hasn't been done before, and if it hasn't been done before, then it's probably not very empirically founded, right? Because it hasn't been done before. And if you then try to do something that works because it's been done before and you've seen it succeed, and you try to perfect that, that's when it's more empirically founded. Yeah. So and if you want to cultivate yourself as a human, you need experience. You need to test things. You need to work on it and perfect it. So that seems to go more in, if you're thinking in terms of painting, it seems to go more in line with perfect and work on what we know works. Yeah. Rather than try to do new things for the sake of doing new things, because that's not going to perfect humanity. You should test out new things, but within the sphere of what sort of works.
Well, it's absurd, because if it is really new, then you don't have any relation to it, and it can't affect you emotionally. And
but occasionally there's some luck, and you do something and it's a bit of a new turn, and it turns out to work very well. And then there's some luck to what you did, and it works very well, and you've done something new. That might work. Because then you start working with it, you learn that this actually works. But I don't think that's very much of a radical change usually. It's just minor, detailed technical stuff that you work and you tweak a little bit here and there, and then it works better. So you perfect it. Exactly. But if you break the foundational rules for the sake of breaking them, it's probably not going to work.
It reminds me of, what's the name of the piece by Mozart? And he was doing this fugue, and it was Glenn Gould talking about it. That was what I noticed. And this is my recap. So when you go in, then in the rules that are sort of set so that they all have to be there. You cannot make it otherwise. You go into making a fugue, and then it becomes impersonal. So you sort of, despite yourself, you start making better music. It's a fascinating idea because Aristotle is basically saying the same thing, that there are certain there's an objectivity there that is impersonal. So and also your relation to the world somehow should be impersonal.
Yeah.
You should only just look at what works as a painter, as whatever you are working with.
Yeah.
And he, of course, and this is a funny example when he talks about you remember he talks about the judge? He says the judge is only concerned with the action, not with the intention of the person acting. Of course, you can talk about that, but I think in this context I understand the point. Is he a nice guy? Yeah, but he still murdered someone. So you look at the fact that he murdered someone or did something great, you know.
But you have to remember in virtue ethics, which is the ethical picture that he draws, it's you have to have the right mind to do something right. So you can't just be the consequences. So you have to have the right mental state. So so that's why it needs cultivation and experience.
So that you don't incidentally act.
Yeah, and also you need to that's how you train yourself to do the right thing in the context, because you make a good judgment, because you have experience, you internalized it, and you react in the right way in a situation because of that experience. So it can't just be that you accidentally do something right or wrong, or you do something because it leads to the right consequences, but your intentions are horrible or something like that. It needs to be, it's a package deal in a sense. And so, but you can occasionally do something that leads to the wrong consequences, or do something that leads to the right consequences for the wrong reasons, and these things happen. But the perfectly virtuous person, he acts out of his virtues in the right context, and that involves doing exactly the right thing, not too much, not too little, not too extreme, not too, what's the opposite of extreme?
In extreme.
So you're the perfect match in a situation. So your action is moderately, perfectly fit for that context, and that's when you're a cultivated, virtuous person. And
that's the same principle that he uses when he talks about catharsis, also in the Poetics. That you have this, if you have a wrong motion to the wrong thing in the wrong circumstance, catharsis at least is a possibility for you to correct that. But if you are in balance, then you are free to enjoy the next level, which is just the mastery of the depiction, if it is tragedy or painting, whatever it is.
And this is also how you recognize things in the Poetics, for example. When you see an artwork and you recognize what it's trying to do, what it's trying to depict, then that recognition is only going to happen if it matches the kind of experience we have.
Exactly. So it cannot be original. So
if it's super original, it's not going to match any experience we have. Yeah. Or if it does, it's accidental. Yeah. So the way I see Aristotle, both in the Ethics and the Poetics, is that he tries to show how we can perfect ourselves as humans. And by doing that, it's actually more or less an empirical research of what does work for a human. What does work? What do we recognize? What do we like? And if you read his rhetorics, his rhetoric, then there too, when you give a nice speech, if you give a beautiful talk or speech that works, you need to know your audience, for example. It's partly empirically based. You can't just give a beautiful speech and it's in the wrong audience.
It's and that's where it does compare giving a speech to making a broader sketch or a more rough way of painting instead of a lecture where you're more into the details.
Yeah, but it needs to match something. That's the important part, I think, in both cases. And in order to get that match, you need to have genuine knowledge of what works and what doesn't, and what humans do recognize, what we do like. And so that's why you need to know your audience. The good speakers realize what kind of audience they have, and they adjust accordingly. And I think the same might work for painting. If you want to paint a beautiful picture, you need to know what people actually think is beautiful.
Exactly.
Again,
it's an impersonal issue.
It could be. I mean, it could be personal in a sense, but you need to make it in a way that's not just about your personal experience. It needs to match the others as well.
And that's that same pointing on that. If you experience something as really striking you, a work strikes you, and it has this personal effect on you, it's because it hits something that is common within the human experience. and you think it's somehow personal or something like that. I remember a guy said that to me, the greatest works, they are great because they're original. And I thought about it, that, well, yeah, well, the same point, then it cannot communicate to us if it's completely original. It has to be, and Aristotle talks about it in Poetics, just a slightly different angle into the same thing, but the core that it points to is known to us.
But originality as a concept is also, in flux, or a flexible concept. I mean, you can be original by just making a tiny tweak so it becomes even better match. You're like, wow, he's always doing that. How does he do it? He's very original in that sense.
Yeah, and
so
you can
concept
also
works for that. But if you just want to do something new for the sake of doing something radical or new, that could also be original, but that's less interesting.
Well, then you get back to this whole idea of is your whole, well, you wrote a book on metaphysics, so correct me if I'm wrong. Is your whole metaphysics based on virtue or just on intention, pure intention? And of course, we should do a dark flame on Kant and Aristotle, judgment and poetics. But his idea is then that sorry, I'll just completely lost the thread. What?
Who? Kant or?
Kant, yeah. Kant is the pure intention. Aristotle is virtue. And then with virtue, of course, you have to base yourself on objectivity. Yeah. It'll come back to me after
I actually have a hard problem
yeah.
with... I'm not sure I understand Kant, actually, to be honest. But
we'll do that in the
he also says in Introduction to the Judgment, Critical Judgment, Kant says that he's not trying to say anything about how to cultivate art or any art form.
Well, he does.
He's just talking about the transcendental preconditions for doing art in his metaphysical system of the different critiques and books. So it's a very weird, it's a weird book, the Judgment book.
But yeah, I guess the point I was getting to is that when you're talking about virtue, and he says you cannot just have virtue, you have to practice it.
Yeah.
And you can improve through practicing. And that's where he goes totally diametrically to the opposite of what Kant is talking about, where craft is just something mechanical that sort of hinders your free expression. So that's where I think, again, reading Aristotle's Ethics, particularly for painters, to be aware of the whole general metaphysics, the whole conception of what is possible is so important. So you don't get stuck in just the craft, but you have to know your whole value basis, the basis of your virtues, so that you can hit the mark even better, because you don't paint just to paint a pretty picture.
Yeah. I think the take-home message that I take from Aristotle, both in the Nicomachean Ethics and the Poetics, is this whole idea of cultivating the human. I think that's the main message I take home. That this idea of working to become our best. And then you have to ask yourself, do you work to become your best by just shooting in the blind to try new stuff and see if you hit some marks? You might hit some marks, but it might be very accidental, and it's not going to last.
And you're not going to
hit one, and then you're going to hit another.
Yeah.
Or do you cultivate yourself as a human being by creating something that you know how it works, how to create, and then try to perfect that? And if it doesn't work perfectly, how can you make it perfectly work? And then you perfect something.
Yeah.
That's the way of cultivating. So imagine a flower. You're going to cultivate your garden. Now you water your flowers, you give it the right soil. If you try to be original in doing that, most of your flowers are going to die.
You plant them upside down.
They're not going to survive, because you're going to try to give them liquor and see if that works. You're going to try to give them water. It's not going to work. You're going to have to know what works, and then you make the beautiful plant. Eventually, over generations, you can mix a plant with another, or especially when it comes to more animals, you can breed them to get a new kind of species. You can try to cultivate things that way as well, but you have to follow the natural rules for how this works. Otherwise, it's not going to cultivate it. You're going to just probably kill it. And I think try to think of the same as cultivating a human being, or cultivating an art form, or painting. You need to know what works, and then you can slowly over generations change it a little bit, and maybe combine two art forms into a new one. Even I'm open for that can work, and then make something really cool that you can cultivate further. But if it's too fast and too explode the ground rules and try something new, it's not going to be cultivation.
Yeah, that's why.
So it's not going to be virtuous in the sense that of the good character traits. You're not going to get the knowledge. You're not going to get. It's all going to be accidental and fun and entertaining, but it's not going to. You have to remember what Aristotle talks about: techne, this creation, this skill of making something, and that's a virtue for Aristotle, and it's a virtue of you know how to do something, and you know why you do the things when you do it to get the result you want. So if I want to draw a portrait, I know how to draw it and I know why I put the shadows and the lights where I put it to make it a portrait. Then I have some kind of techne, some kind of skill, knowing how or this virtue. And that's something you can perfect by working on it more and more. And when you cultivate and work on that skill, you become better and better.
Surprise.
And you can actually say why you become better because you're actually cultivating something that have been tried out.
And this
is like the plant. You cultivate it by knowing the rules.
This is interesting because
that's how the objectivity comes in, right?
Exactly. So the whole idea of originality is really destructive in several ways because it's one thing, it negates virtue because it negates experience, long-term practice that gradually makes you better and your ability to see that you're actually getting better. And this is an example that, this is again, as I say, anecdotal. This student of mine, she went to an art school and she said it was not uncommon that the teachers were inactive like 6 months at a time because they had some mental issues going on. And I thought about it, this is my take on it. Well, of course, if you do this and this is okay and this is okay and this is okay because it's your expression, it's your originality, then nothing's okay. If everything's valid, everything's invalid. So you only stand there looking at yourself in the mirror to find you, and you don't get any external corrections, and that drives a man crazy.
And originality too is usually for the young ones.
Well, I saw an exhibition.
Because you're trying to break out, you're trying to find yourself, you do original stuff, it's fun, but eventually you grow up and you have to cultivate what you have and know that works, and things calm down. And
well, that's I talked to a philosopher. He made a good point in saying that all typical example, Friday night, Saturday night, people are going to sort of break the rules, break bottles and so, and thereby confirming the rule that you shouldn't break a bottle in the streets.
Yeah.
So it's like that, oh, I'm being a bit, making revolution, protesting against my parents, and then it just cements that, and you find all of this cool people that in 5 years later they're just so settled they couldn't be more settled.
I also think another interesting aspect with the cultivation case of the human is that when we know that humans like harmony rather than disharmony, and we know that humans like symmetry rather than asymmetry, and it's an interesting question why, because harmony and symmetry is calming, it's not stressful, so it gives you calm, and this is evolutionary condition partly. I mean, when you're in the circumstance and everything is calm, there's no danger. But when there's something that sticks out or something that's weird and doesn't fit in, you have a disharmony, and that's when that's a danger sign. So you're alert, and I think when you cultivate what you know, there's more harmony than when you try to do something original or something new. That's alert. So it creates an alert effect, and that's when you're young and very eager and you're trying to, do new, find yourself. The alert aspect is, I think, can be more interesting than when you're like 40, 50, 60, 70 years old. You're done with being alert. So in that sense, the cultivation, it feels more harmonious. Is that the word? Harmony. As a human being, you feel more whole. Yeah, and when you feel more whole and less fragmented, you also become, I think, ultimately, a more interesting and better person, because you become the whole person that you can become, rather than just flying around trying new things.
This is great. So
I think
lack of originality is a presupposition for having a healthy life.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So, but again, the originality, you're using it a little bit extreme, I think.
No, just using it in an art lingo way.
Yeah, maybe something. Because you can be original within certain limits here, and you can be crazy original.
In a neutral term, yeah. I mean, you can say that Edvard Nerdrum then is original, but then you start looking at all the influences, and it turns out it's just an eclectic. It is an eclectic.
But I understand what you're saying. I mean, the original in the sense of I try to do something radically new, or I try to be exciting, or. And that can be, I think some people should do it, because if everyone was cultivating this one thing, that would be boring as well. So I think it's healthy if, I've always said that I think it's healthy if maybe 5-10% of the population are crazy, because that sort of keeps the bubble not, a danger of popping.
You mean like
you need to be
tricksters?
You need to justify what you're doing. You stay a little bit alert, but not too much.
But
if 80% are crazy, that's when it's gone too far.
But I think originality is, and again it has that strong art air to it, is quite redundant. You don't even have to use it, because it's more than enough that you have a love for what you do. You're trying to develop your virtue, and you do that by actually looking at nature. I mean, that in any age is always the radical solution. That's why people get burnt on stake, because they actually looked at reality. So if you start looking at reality, we talked about this before, Hertevig, that doesn't know how clouds look like. Well, actually he's the one who's been looking at the clouds. Therefore you think they don't look like that, because you don't really study clouds, right? So it's more than enough that to just bring in empiricism, and that's the fantastic thing about Aristotle, is saying that, well, you need to know your values, but you also need to relate to empirical reality. If you're not, you don't get anywhere.
Yeah, you need to actually observe.
Yeah,
the good painters are the ones who actually see what to look for.
Exactly.
But you also need to see what's not important as part of it. So this is also with virtues and good judgment in general, is that you need to know what to look for. That's important in the context you're in. So if you want to make a portrait, you need to look for the right features that will capture what you want to create. Yeah. Because then, and if you know that, and if you can look for that, you have what he calls technique, because then you know how and why you put what you put down to capture you.
So virtue and technique presupposes you know what a direction, or the direction
you know
that you're going
what to look for and why, and you also, by that, know what not to look for. So you know what you can ignore because it's not important. Yeah. And that's when you start to really dig into, the more depths of it. Yeah. But if you just want to do something exciting, you don't need to do that. You can just do something that's weird.
And that's why I always say that you should never be open to everything, because you lose out on too much. Yeah. You lose out on going in depth, good understanding more. Yeah,
so I like to distinguish two types of freedom. I'm very concerned with freedom. That's my main virtue in life, main value in life. Yeah. And there's two types of freedom. One is that you have all these options in front of you, and you can choose any one of them. So you're like, I'm very free. I can choose between many different kinds of options, more than you. Then I'm more free than you. I have many more options than you, so I'm more free than you. That's one notion of freedom. Another notion of freedom is that someone sets the limits for you. And they say, you can't do these things. So you rule out all these options. You have to work on these fewer options. And that creates a different kind of freedom, because now you have the freedom to focus on the few options rather than choosing between many. So this is how I think of raising kids, for example. You can raise the kids with two types of freedom. You can say, do whatever you want. And you can raise a kid by saying, you can't do this and this and this, you need to focus on that. And that's two types, both have their virtues, but that's two types of freedom, because on the one you can do whatever you want, but on the other you have more time and energy to focus on something very specific. If the options you rule out are all the good ones, then you're in trouble. Because then your only freedom is to do something terrible, like if you're in a very fascist state, or you're in a dictatorship that says you can't do this and this and this, you have to do that, and that's a terrible thing. Then you have that kind of freedom to perfect it. But it's not a good one.
We're not now talking about the last 2 years.
No. But it's not a good one.
It's coincidental.
But so it's not a good one. But if the ruling out of the option, if the parents rule out the bad options, and those that are actually bad, and they say, focus on these good ones, then that's like a very good kind of freedom, because you have the space and the time and the energy to just focus on. You don't have to worry about all these others. But of course, we all need that kind of balance. We can't be too restricted, because then we feel unfree. And we can't be too unrestricted, because then we also feel unfree, because we don't know what to focus on. It's all like accidental. We don't know which one to pick. So to find that magical balance, I think, is the clue to cultivating a human. This is why you say that it needs a village to raise a kid, because you need a good village that rules out some options, but not too many.
And that's interesting,
this is what you get from Aristotle, I think.
Yeah, and then as I see it, it's the opposite. You get, and again, we should do a separate dark lane on the critical judgment versus poetics. But with this whole idea of originality, there is in the art sense, you're saying that this village should split up and not have content, because that's the typical thing that you hear. Oh, you've been a student of Bork Nerdrum, should you liberate yourself and become yourself and all these things? I mean, this is something I heard from like people who can't even spell the word philosophy. They said, oh, shouldn't you be more modern and be yourself? And so what Aristotle is saying when he's talking about virtue, there are objective criteria and things that are impersonal, is that even though you don't, let's say you don't have a specific idea in the direction, as long as you start looking at what are good virtues or what are virtues, then I guess that will crystallize out of that, because there's something impersonal there that you start realizing, and then through that you can start to understand where your strength is, and then narrow it down to that and pursue that more in much better way, and then not being concerned that it has to be done in my way. No, there are certain criteria for that discipline. So if I come into it thinking I'm going to be me, I'm going to be disappointed and heartbroken all the time because, oh no, I'm being stopped by people who want to decide over me. No, it's not that. It's the principles you have to follow if you want to make a fantastic composition or write a novel or write philosophy.
I think it's in general a good rule not to try to be yourself too much.
Yeah.
Because you need to look outwards and you need to look towards other things. Yeah. So I don't think the narcissist will ever find any meaning or goodness or have a good life, because it's too inward looking. And you need to look out to things and see, can I work on this? How can I make that better? And when you immerse yourself or give yourself to that project, that's when I think when you reach kind of freedom and a meaningful state and moments of happiness, when you cultivate and work on something that's given outside of yourself. I think there's something deeply human about that, to look outwards and try to be part of something there and try to cultivate that.
It's almost like the same need for myths, something that is eternal, that is outside of you and has objective value. And when you are basing your life on certain virtues, then you can go much longer by yourself. It becomes these people who give you advice, say you shouldn't do that, you should do this, that works, that doesn't work. And this is a fantastic thing that Munch says about a friend of his who's quoting poetry, and he says, Höst was his name, is not alone, he has Homer with him. And that's a fantastic thing. You have that whole world, or these you have Aristotle in your head, you have Homer in your head, you have whatever, and they can guide you. That's a fantastic image.
This is how I think of literature and art in general. I mean, it makes you less lonely. The good stuff. So the bad stuff makes you more lonely. But the good stuff. The good stuff. So the eternally, the classics, the good works, like paintings by Rembrandt or Homer or Aristotle, or the if you read Goethe's Faust, it just makes you less lonely, because you see that people across generations in different periods of time have felt and done the same mistakes and felt the same as you, and you get comfort by that. And
that's it. So it's not
it's the virtue of reading a good book, is that you recognize something that makes you less lonely. So not that it necessarily solves your problem or eases your sorrow if you've been through something horrible, but there's some kind of comfort in just an aside on that, going with Boris Koller into a church in outside of Vienna. And I really noticed it because, of course, culturally speaking, I'm Protestant. And you come in there, and this woman had donated a painting of, I guess, herself, giving her dead child to Christ. And I'm thinking, that's wonderful. Because what you need in that situation is not to know what is physically happening to your child as it's lying in a coffin. You need to
have some kind of comfort through that, and it's a comfort also to.
Wait, she was giving the child
In a
as it was dead or alive?
Yeah,
it was dead already.
Yeah. So it was.
She wasn't sacrificing it.
No, yeah. So like, here's my child, and that's very
comforting.
That's a comforting thing to do.
They do that too. I mean, that's what Abraham was trying to do in the Bible.
Right. Okay. No, but that wasn't true. The truth. But it's really comforting. I mean, doesn't solve the problem, but it's comforting.
Yeah, and I think this is also what Aristotle talks about with the mimesis. All art is mimesis, he says, or all poiesis, all poetry is mimesis. Yeah. So creating something is mimesis, and he basically means that you create something that imitate or picture something that could have happened. And when you recognize, it needs to be recognizable as something that could have happened. Yeah. That's when we say that an artwork, a book or something is believable, it's
credible.
I believe the character. Yeah. It's credible.
Yeah.
This is the mimesis aspect. You need to actually recognize it as something that you can recognize could have happened. And when you do that, you feel less lonely because you recognize something out there. Yeah. So it's a communication. So this is also why when you're in a relationship with someone and you recognize each other, you're less lonely. And the same goes for art. And I think if you have no human recognition, no human, relationships, you're a loner. You read a good book, you get less lonely.
So how does
But you can't do that if it's just super original work that you don't recognize anything.
Exactly. That's like horrible. That's really horrible. There's no contact.
Yeah. So this is why when I go to a lot of art exhibitions and see also contemporary stuff that I don't like. I go to see it because I want to, try to see why I don't like it. Yeah. And I feel depressed and I feel more lonely when I go there, from there.
So what
because there's nothing I recognize. There's nothing I feel alienated. I don't feel they're capturing anything in me. And it might be me that's weird, and it might be them that's not capturing anything. So what about
the argument that life is chaotic and we all are fragmented, so when they make that, it's even truer mimesis of how we are?
But that's just, so when you say that, I'm like, yeah, but that's shallow. It's nothing interesting in that claim that makes me feel deeper human. There's nothing there. It's like, if I go see someone try to paint a green painting to represent nature, I'm bored. It's not getting any deeper. It doesn't connect me with reality in a way that makes me less lonely. So that's the problem. It needs to be a recognitional aspect. But the danger is that you never know if it's you or them. That's off.
Yeah, well, that's the cliche. That if you don't understand it, you're the stupid one. Yeah. That's what their advantage. That's their, what do you call it, the Motte and Bailey, where you lure people into this idea that you're trying to understand it, and then they give you the blame because when you don't understand it.
So I talked to a person, I didn't know who it was, but I talked to someone at the latest Nerdrum exhibition in Oslo, and he said something interesting. So he said that so we were talking about the eternal aspects that you recognize and feel less lonely, and these issues we're talking about now, in connection to the paintings we were looking at. And he said that that some of the paintings that he was looking at was too timeless, too not placed in time and space. Okay. So he couldn't recognize them. So he didn't see himself in them because they were too timeless. But then he said Edvard Hopper, the painter Edvard Hopper, which I also actually happen to like quite a bit. He's a good storyteller. And he said that in those pictures, which is clearly located in America in the 40s, 30s, 40s, and maybe 50s. He's located clearly in a time, but he also tells stories that are eternal. And this guy said that he recognized himself in those more than in Nerdrums because they were too timeless and too spaceless. And I think I don't agree with him, but I think that's an interesting observation, because it might be that some people recognize something in a timely manner. They recognize something eternal in a very timely manner because they haven't raised, the viewpoint above their own time. So they recognize something that they say, "Oh, this is me." Yeah. In a very, 1950s painting.
There's a little opening to eternity there.
Yeah.
You're saying.
But then others, on the other hand, you might say, well, you need to. you recognize the truly eternal in something that's not at all in any time. So I don't have an answer to this, but I think it's very interesting. I think he actually said something interesting there, that you can create something that has this like deeply recognitional, I feel less lonely aspect to it, even though it's very rooted to a time. But I think it's very few that can do that. I think Hopper might be. I was just trying to push you on Hopper.
No.
You like or dislike?
I can. Well, you have that night talks, and I can guess I can see that. I'm not trying to be patronizing. I mean, I can see an argument for that, but I think if you start talking about something that is eternal in a sort of contemporary situation, Andrew Wyeth is on totally next level. That's a different world, and that's also, he's been accused of painting rural America of the 50s, but he's not doing that.
Yeah.
He uses those as props, and then you get to this. I can never forget a crow flew by, or tenant farming with this deer hanging outside that house. Yeah. And for some reason, he manages to get you to identify with that deer hanging from the tree. Yeah. It's so strange. But then, of course, you also have, and this is really one of my favorite books, The Great Gatsby, which seems to be about 1920s, but there's this thing between Daisy and Gatsby, obviously, and all of these things that we have done a different dark film on. So obviously you can do that, but I have to say I side with on the side of stripping things down, getting to the core so there's as little as possible hindering you to identify with it. Yeah,
but Wyeth too is, I see what you're saying. But what I think what I do like about the Hopper paintings is that he managed to paint a story in a way that's very interesting. So you're sort of like the viewer that peeks into someone's life, and it's very quiet. All his pictures are quiet. So when he paints something, it's like he's painting silence that tells a story. And I think there's something magical about that. So you're just seeing other people's life. You're looking into a window, for example, and you see someone do something on the inside of that apartment, and you're not supposed to see it.
You're saying that there's an empathy there.
There's something like deeply human about that. Like, I am outside viewing everyone else, and I'm deeply here, and I can't communicate with them. It's all silent, and you can't reach out. And he sort of depicts a deep loneliness. And when you see that, you feel less lonely. That's my point. So that's like the magic of it. And he can do that very well, I think. But he's very... So I think he is an example of someone who manages to communicate in a very... make us feel less lonely, but also in a way that's not too... I don't know, maybe he's the most modern painter I like.
It's...
I'm not sure why we started on this.
But no, that's fine. But okay, so you can tie that back to Aristotle's. I mean, we're jumping from branch to branch here, but that's fine. But I was just thinking about his position. Well, does he say anything about it, about being contemporary somehow? I guess no, but
so if you tie it to Aristotle, you can say that Hopper. In order for Hopper to paint as he does, he needs to know what to look for, and he needs to know how to depict it in order to get that. So if you agree that one of the things the Hopper's paintings do is to depict an existential loneliness that when you're always locked inside yourself and you're always peeking at others' lives, you can't really take part in them. If that's one of the things he wants to show you, so you can feel it and feel less lonely and communicate with him that way, then he needs to know how to paint that. So he needs to have an idea of what to paint. It can't just be accidental that all his paintings have this aspect to them. So in that sense, he has cultivated, he has the skills of knowing how to do that. So he has a goal, and he knows what he wants to create, and he knows which means he can use to get to that. Now, there are many ways he could have gotten there, but he manages to get there in a way that communicates with people that aren't too invested in art, for example. So he communicates well with ordinary people. And the guy I talked to, he was a totally normal person who had nothing to do with art. He wasn't an artist, he wasn't intellectual. He was just a regular guy going to, he was actually a millionaire that was thinking of investing. But,
but a regular guy, yeah.
A regular guy, so he saw something there. And I think Hopper captured that. And to do that, Hopper couldn't have thought, oh, I'm going to do something exciting and new. He could only have thought, I'm going to, how can I express this? It couldn't have been accidental. I think that's the main point. So that's also like very Aristotelian. You have to cultivate and work with.
I understand your point. I mean, I think Hopper is, I have to say I haven't seen it in person, but in terms of painterliness, it's quite weak. But I see the point. And in any case,
I think he's a storyteller more than a painter.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. At least in the best works, but so what Aristotle is doing then when he's talking about virtue, and he says at one point there that, how does he formulate it? What we know is eternal. If we know something, that means that it's objective and it is eternal. So what he's saying, I mean, if you speaking again of metaphysics, if you go into that way of thinking and that becomes your metaphysics, your whole outlook on the life or how you want to define it, then per definition, even if you do imagery that is more contemporary, that will turn it and crank it towards something that is eternal, because you're concerned with what is objectively present there.
Yeah. So Aristotle makes the distinction between knowledge of what couldn't have been different. Yeah. And then the reflection on what could have been different.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's the distinction. Yeah. So scientific knowledge, as Aristotle calls it, is the knowledge of the things that couldn't have been different. But when you create something, and if you're anything from a carpenter to a painter to a writer, when you create something, you are making decisions about how things can be. So you say, could have put it there, but I'm going to put it here. So that kind of knowledge is more of a knowing how to do something. And the scientific knowledge, or the episteme, which is the Greek concept for it, is knowledge of things that couldn't have been different. So those are eternal, necessary in Aristotle's sense. And then the technical knowledge, or the techne, that's knowledge of how to do something.
That has to do with decision.
It's decision making. And when you know how to do something and you know why you do it along the way, that's when you have that kind of knowledge or that kind of virtue.
Let me check something with you, because this is the definition that I've heard. The Greeks, when they were building a temple, they put a stick in the ground with a line in it to start measuring, and that's the episteme. That's the vantage point, the central point from which they build everything else. Have you heard that? No. Okay, I just wanted to check if that, because that fascinates me, because it grounds it literally in something that's solid. Of course, you can say that if you look at the universe, we're basically looking down when we're looking up at the sky. So what is up and what is down? But I mean, at some point you're here, and then you have to decide, this is the point I'm starting from, and that's the objectivity, obviously. Yeah,
but I think Aristotle had very. It's unclear what he meant by couldn't have been different. So in contemporary...
Well, he does say that you don't evaluate or decide over things that you cannot change. You don't evaluate if this is a book or not. Yeah. You know it's a book, and you don't need to waste your time judging it.
Yeah, but on the other hand, it could have been different. So it could have been that this book was a hallucination.
Or still a tree.
Yeah.
So still a tree is more...
So it's unclear what he means, but so you elaborate, make decisions, and contemplate over things that could have been different, but you don't worry about, could 2 + 2 be 5? Because it's 4.
They do now, but if you're thinking Aristotelian, you don't.
Yeah, it's 4, so there's no point.
And that's interesting, because then when you start breaking down those barriers, because they're seriously talking about that 4 + 4 might be 5, and it's a prejudice to say that it has to be 4 every time, blah, blah, blah. So when you start breaking those things, you start breaking down things that are objective, and then your whole ability to act in the world crumbles. And that's the problem of subjectivism, and that's the mental need, or the validity of what Aristotle is talking about. He says that reality actually exists, so you can be mentally healthy and act in the world.
mean, he is one of the. So in the history of philosophy, that some people think that everything divides between Plato and Aristotle.
Mm-hmm.
So it just goes two directions. And Aristotle was the empirical oriented one, and Plato was the abstract, less empirically oriented one. So the traditional debate is, the Aristotle's idea of a form and substance, and then Plato's idea of an idea. So for Plato, forms were abstract, eternal things, and the horse, for example, was an exemplification of that form of a horse. For Aristotle, it was the other way around. So the horse existed, and then the form came from the horse.
Yeah,
so in order to
from experiencing horses, you get an idea of horse.
There needs to be at least one horse for there to be the form of a horse.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be this horse, but it needs to be one horse.
Sounds reasonable.
And for Plato, it's the other way around.
Yeah.
The horse is striving towards the ideal of form of a horse, which exists independently.
But I have to ask you, because it's almost too good to be true, does Plato seriously believes that the idea is more real than the horse?
Yeah.
Like as a separate entity?
Yeah.
So almost physical separate entity
it's
that
not
actually
physical,
exists.
It's like
no, but it's like it's something that actually exists.
It's in the heaven of forms.
Yeah.
And it's that's what the
it sounds like some communist slogan, reality is somewhere else.
Yeah, I mean he literally thinks that. So that's why he doesn't like artists and poets, for example, because they're 3 steps from the truth. So when an artist creates a painting or a poem, he imitates, so say I paint a portrait of you. Then I'm 3 steps from the truth according to Plato, because I imitate you, which trying to imitate a form. So I'm far away from the truth. So I don't have much value. For Aristotle, it's different because you are first and then the form comes from you. So when I imitate you, I'm much closer to something real.
Yeah.
So that's why the artist would have more value for Aristotle, because he's trying to make us see what's real. And Plato we're like removing ourselves from the real. Yeah. We should rather contemplate the forms directly.
And what's your take on it? I read somewhere, this was not Plato himself, but it was an interpretation that Plato is saying that, well, if you representation or imitation is in itself negative, there's something wrong about that. But if you do an exact copy, literally exact copy, at least it deviates less from reality, and then it's sort of less evil.
If you do an exact copy?
Yeah, like a photographic so-called copy, then it's at least less evil.
That sounds weird.
Have you heard about that?
No.
We should do a dark frame on Aristotle and Plato as well.
So let me ask you, when you paint a portrait, what's the goal?
The goal is, I think, Nerdrum said it perfectly, to get that brain behind the eye. So the portrait is looking at you and not you're just looking at the portrait. So of course with the portrait, if you're literally talking about just the head, the neck a little bit, it's quite limited to how much kind of an action or story you can make, but you can get that presence of the eyes, that the mood of it, that will be the story. And then it's what we started with. What is the ultimate goal? It's not to just get the eyes in the correct place, but to get them to show some kind of emotion. Because that's a story. That's why you're doing it, not to stop with paint. Or at the level of just a painterly reproduction.
So you want to capture the person, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think this is something that another painter, Lucillista, wrote about. How Aristotle is not only talking about imitating the outer form, but imitating the human nature. And I think that second thing is what a lot of painters don't really think about. And if you can get that as well, because that's at least 50% of what a human being is, then you really...
So if I had 2 portraits, I had 2 portraits of you, and I had one of them captured you, and everyone saw that was you, and in a sense it captured you, it captured what's behind those eyes, as you said. It captures you, the person, Jan-Ove. And the other portrait captured that, but it also captures something deeply human, more generally. It captured like the humanity in Jan-Ove.
Yeah.
It's the latter one that's the ideal goal.
Yeah, and that's always the balancing act. And you can see that if you compare typical classicistic work, like you think 18th and 19th century, a very pure, clear form, so pure and clear that it becomes stiff. that's not what we're talking about, because that's an idealization that becomes remote from life. If you go back to, well, you take the Hermes with the child Dionysus, which is, I don't think you would find that specific person, but he gets the essence of it. And you have that story about the Venus figure, which was modeled after the 5 most beautiful women in the town, so that you can get the most essential things. And that's always the balancing act. Speaking of knowing then the goal, so that when you start messing around with manipulating reality, it doesn't become just surrealism, but it goes to the goal that the overarching goal that you're aware of.
It's interesting. Because I think you become my theory is that the best painters or the best artists of any kind actually are the ones who have a deeper philosophy of what they're doing. So I'm first and foremost a philosopher, and so I like to think that the best ones have the philosophy in place.
So when you catch up with me, you'll be far superior. I'm looking forward to becoming your student.
So because if you just know how to paint, that's interesting, but it's not enough. It's not.
You can be led anywhere then, and that's the tragedy of Edvard Munch, which is so-called inexplicable, that he had that massive talent. We're talking about Rembrandt level talent, and extremely cultivated. I mean, he went to school like maybe 1 year in total, so he was reading like hell at home. And that's the best way to do it. And still he sees the expressionist and thinks, oh no, I'm getting old-fashioned, I have to adjust. That's so weird, and that goes to show that well, again, I guess we're talking about the metaphysics. Your metaphysics, your what you value as or what you see as the direction in life. If that goes this way, but I want to be a classical painter and that goes this way, then the values that you have drag you away from that goal. You have to be aware of the general, your values, your virtues. What are virtues? And then, especially because we're so indoctrinated, or we learn this through osmosis today. And this thing about, I have to be myself is so embedded in us. You have to be ready to not sacrifice, but to realize that these things actually don't help me, but I've based my life on those 3 values, but I want to go here. Okay, well then it doesn't benefit me. I change these values and I try to train myself into those new values. I think that's the most important thing, because what's in your head, that comes out through your hand. No matter how skilled you are, you can have really skilled painters that just crumble because they don't know where they're going with it.
Because this relates to Aristotle says that when you have this attitude of creating something, this poiesis, poetry, which is broadly understood for him, when you to have a techne, this virtue that we talked about, you need to have it you need to be creating something with a true concept. That's the phrase he uses. And I
always sort of start backing when I hear true, but what does it mean by that?
So this is the point. I think what he means is roughly what we're getting to now. I mean, I think he means something like when you make something, say a painting, a portrait of you, that in order to really have the virtue of techne, which is his main creative virtue, you need to...
Which is just not just craft.
No, it's not just craft. You need to know why and how to do what you want to achieve. So you need to have a goal, and you need to know the skills to achieve it, but you also need to know why you do what you're doing to get to that goal.
So the true concept without the goal.
Yeah, so the true concept is the knowledge of the principles and goals that you're trying to get to.
Yeah, so being aware of the principles you have to follow to achieve your goal, that's true concept.
And that's why I think it's, and that lines up with what I was trying to say, that the best painters have the philosophy behind what they're doing in place.
Yes.
They have the knowledge and the goals and the true concept, as Aristotle would say, before they do it. So when you hear painters say that they start on the painting and they start out randomly and they do something and all of a sudden they end up somewhere and then they finish, I sort of feel sad because I want them to have more of a plan. Of course, there's luck involved in any of these processes. And Aristotle also says that luck goes well with techne. So you work within something and then you hit a mark and you go, oh, that works.
Because you see that it works.
Yeah, it's like it's a calculated luck.
Yeah.
But if it's all random, accidental, it's just there's nothing even close to what he would call the virtue of Techne.
Yeah.
So it lines up nicely that you confirmed the portrait question I had. With, the theory that you have an idea of why and how to get to that something that you want to achieve.
Yeah, and it ties
and my point about Hopper was that I think he had that. I think you're underestimating Hopper a little bit. I think you should reevaluate Edward Hopper because he has that. I think he has that. I agree that Wyeth has it, and he's a better painter in many ways. But again, if not just being a good painter is the goal, but what you're trying to achieve as well. And I think Hopper might achieve that recognitional aspect of that loneliness and that silence, of existential silence, which is sort of like scary and lonely. He has that. He has that in place, and I think he's.
You should always compare, and then if you then put Hopper and you have Wyeth, but then on the other side you place Lucian Freud, then I see your point there.
Wait, so which order would you have them? Freud
at the bottom, obviously,
and then
Hopper, and then Wyeth.
Yeah, I would.
Don't say you like Lucian Freud.
No, I mean, so I've used him a couple of times as an example because his portraits of his mother, for example. What's interesting about them is that he paints his mother on the bed, lying there, old, looking into the empty air. And what's interesting about them is that he manages to capture his mother. It's very concrete. You're actually thinking that it's his mother that's lying there. So he does capture his mother, but he doesn't capture anything that, in a good way, I think. He doesn't capture anything more than his mother. So he doesn't like reach that, like I said, if I paint a portrait of you and I capture you, but I also capture the humanity in Jan-Ove. He captures his mother very well, but I'm not seeing clearly how he captures much more than his mother.
Yeah.
So that's my problem with Freud.
Yeah, it's when the model is a model being painted.
And they're all in his studio, they're all on his bed. Yeah. It's very concrete. Yeah. And the flesh is very amazing, and I'm sort of like I'm fascinated by him, but I don't think he manages to lift the philosophy of what he's doing up to the level where you have like in the Rembrandt and others. He doesn't get up there.
But in the Poetics he talks about universals, and
wait, who?
Aristotle. In the Poetics talks about the universal level, or the universals, and it really fascinates me, and I've really come to realize that now that we've actually been talking about it, that when he talks about virtue, talking about these objective principles that you have to acknowledge are there, then your work implicitly will get a more universal content. So what Freud is doing, you can say, well, people of course always lie on beds in a specific room, but that's like one fraction of reality. And the whole idea of how depressed or passive they are, well, you can be that sometimes, but that's like one little photograph of reality out of the whole range of human possibilities, which makes it too narrow. And I see your point that in that sense, Hopper has more of it because it has a greater melancholy, and then
there's a great level of melancholy.
That is topped in Hawaii.
Yeah, he has a great level of melancholy and existential loneliness, and that.
And that's empathy.
And so he has these emotions, and I think most of his paintings are about this existential loneliness aspect, where we look into someone else's life and we peek in secretly without being allowed. We see them do something, and it's very like, in through the window from the outside, and he has. I don't think it's too important how good of a painter he is. What's important for him is that he tells that story, and he captures the eternal virtues and eternal truths in that storytelling.
You're bouncing on a knife's edge now.
In a way, and I think it's interesting because if he couldn't have done that with abstract painting, but absolutely. If he made it too realistic, it would be too concretely rooted in a particular time and space. Yeah. So that wouldn't work either.
Well, and because he does strip things down.
Yeah, he does. And he manages to get that story on that balance, I think, between the very rooted in a specific time and place and the very too much of that and the too much of the abstract, we don't recognize what's going on. He does manage to find that balance in an interesting way.
Yeah, I think when you talk about him, you have to talk about specific works because there are so many that are really weak. but then there is that strength in that. For example, Nighthawks.
Yeah, but there are many like the Nighthawks.
Yeah, but just take an example that people undoubtedly know. So if you then think about Freud, you can say, okay, people lie in beds every now and then, but they're not depressed all the time. So that's a very low level. Then you have Hopper, and it has that empathy with that situation. But compared to Wyeth, you see that what Hopper does is still, given that there is some kind of empathy there, and therefore something that is more eternal, it's still tied up to something that is a bit too specific. But Andrew Wyeth manages, even though it's still a concrete situation, it becomes something that is eternalized. It's very vague to use those terms, I know, but still, if you compare it, there is some kind of this atmosphere to Wyeth than with Hopper.
Yeah, I'll go home and study the two next to each other and try to figure out.
We should do that
more.
because we're talking quite abstract here, so you need to look at.
I think there's a fine distinction here. But I think what Freud doesn't manage is to get above that very concreteness, that very particular studio day he painted his mother. He doesn't manage to get over that, and I think Hopper manages to get above that. That's why I'm trying to, talk him up a little bit. I see
the point. It's just a question of what kind of levels are we talking about? Which painters are you comparing it with? If
we get back to that guy I talked to at the exhibition that recognized himself more in the Hopper paintings. I think
he said that?
He said that.
Okay. Yeah.
And I think why that was interesting is that Hopper managed to get that above that concrete particular case that we talked about. But he managed to do it in a way that I think relates to the less cultivated people, to be honest. So less intellectual, less readable, people who have read less and thought less about this. He managed to get close to them quickly. And I think there's a virtue to that too.
Oh yeah.
He doesn't overdo it. So he managed to get to a balance that I think Aristotle would have liked. That's my main point. Because Aristotle says that you need to get that mimesis aspect, right? You need to get that recognitional aspect. We need to see something of ourselves, better or worse or the same, but we need to see it and recognize it and feel those emotions. Then we leave the theater and we feel better and we're, mentally released somehow. And I think Hopper does that pretty well. Even though he's not my favorite painter, he does that pretty well in a sense that relates to many people.
It's always a question of comparing, so you start seeing what different levels people are on, and then you can see that someone has a more eternal quality, but still there's a difference of how eternal painters can be. But if you compare Hopper then to more typical sort of what I call New York realism made today, people on subways and on train stations or whatever, you can see that's technically fine and so, but then it's only that person standing there. There is no more than that. And that does not mean that technique is unimportant, obviously. But there's absolutely a point there that you want something that, and this is also why Aristotle is mentioning in the Poetics that this animal that you can paint, and if it has an anatomical mistake, but it helps the picture, it's not an anatomical mistake, which is different from making a mistake because you don't know anatomy.
Yeah.
But again,
my hypothesis, my claim is that I think Hopper gets above that New York realism kind of thing.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying too. Yeah, absolutely.
And he also has a bunch of pictures from the countryside and the distinction between inside the house and the wild nature outside. That whole distinction between culture and nature. He depicts that very well, and he does have some really, I think, universal aspects that are easily recognizable and has some internal aspects to them, which I find interesting. I wanted to push you on it.
No, but that's fine. It's the same way as you can. I can look at Bøhn and I see these amazing painterly qualities, but still, of course, if you compare that with Edvard Munch or Titian, obviously Bøhn becomes too simple. So it's not more difficult than that. You can see qualities in painters. You can draw from that, but you can do it on a higher level. Yeah. So
maybe I would put Freud here, and then I would put Hopper and Wyeth here, and I wouldn't totally agree with you to tilt it like this yet.
Just put Hopper in between. It's not very difficult. Or we could take Freud aside because it's on such a low level, and you start with, I mean, if so-called modern painting, if the standard or the lowest was Hopper, it would be an amazing thing. And I'm not saying that he's as low as Hopper, as Freud, for God's sakes. But there is a funny story I have to tell you. I know this art historian who's written about Odd, and she was a guy did guided tours on his retrospective exhibition in 1998. Speaking of recognition, and she told me this story about how they went around, they came to woman killing an injured man, and there's this big guy. They come there and he looks at the painting, he sits down, and he just leans his head in his hand and starts shaking his head. Like an immediate, I don't know if he had been through a divorce or whatever it was, but it was an immediate recognition of what was going on there. And I think that's what we're talking about when you...
Yeah, and I think my point was that I think Hopper manages to get that. But yeah.
But Hopper, yeah. Talk about Rembrandt. But the Hopper, yeah.
But yeah. Yeah. Is there anything else in there you liked? There's one more thing I would like to mention in this book.
Two.
Because he talks about friendship a lot in this book. So friendship was very important to the Greeks, and different kinds of friendship. You could have a friendship that was of use to you, and you could have a friendship that was more pure and was just because the other person was good. So you had like a friendship with someone because you were good. You exchanged, you were just good to each other. That kind of friendship. Different kinds of friendship. But what he says that there can't. And the friendship and love sort of is interconnected concepts here. So Sophia, philosophy comes from philos and Sophia, and this means the love of wisdom, but it also means friendship towards wisdom.
Right.
The concept of philosophy, and he says that you can't have friendship or real friendship towards an object. And I find this kind of interesting. So, because imagine painting again, or drawing, or some kind of creating something. So you and I can have a friendship, he says, because it can be mutual. But when it comes to a painting, I can't have a friendship with it because it can't be mutual. And I think this is an interesting idea, because I think you can want, my question is, can you have a friendship towards painting?
A painting or painting?
Both, actually.
This is very...
Can you feel... Imagine... So you have to remember that friendship and love is sort of interconnected here. So maybe love is a better word. So think of love, and think of love as this relationship I can have with someone. When I want that person, I want everything good for that person. I want good things to happen to that person. Then I sort of love that person. And it can be mutual. And I think you can have that kind of loving relationship towards art or painting. Sorry, I used the art word that you don't like.
Use the A word all the time.
But paint, I think we're in the old term, like skills.
Oh, yeah, right. That's
the art of, the skill of. But imagine, so can you feel that kind of love and friendship towards painting, for example? In the sense that I want everything good to happen to painting.
Yeah.
So I want the activity of painting to be flourish and be in its best state. And that seems to me to be a kind of one-way friendship towards painting.
Yeah, but also
or one-way love towards painting.
I mean, Alden has been talking about how you stand in front of it and you cannot get enough. And it's the same thing if you are bodily together with someone you really love, you cannot get enough of that person.
Yeah, so I bought a painting recently, and I get it into the house, and it's like I got a new friend. Right? Yeah. You can watch it every day.
And again,
you
it's
can
like
look at it.
That's like you're hearing what Aristotle is saying to you in your head, because you get these concepts into your head.
But he doesn't like that. That's my problem. I think I disagree with him on this. So he says that you can't have love and friendship towards an object. Then
again, I guess you're talking about. Well, he wasn't a painter.
Yeah.
So there's always some kind of weakness or incompleteness, of course, in a thinker. So it's But there's another thing that he talks about that I really found interesting too. That this thing, and I guess it ties up to friendship, and this idea of gratitude. How someone helps you, and then you help them back. Not as okay, now you owe me, and then you pay me back or so, but for the sake of friendship. And again, that's why I think Aristotle is such a fantastic philosopher to read, and why the ethics, despite the fact that it doesn't tell you how to paint, is fundamental to a painter, because it touches upon something fundamental and which Kant breaks, or the whole art idea breaks with originality, that severs you from the person you could learn from, the person that you could have that love for and relationship to. If you see someone that is like you, oh no, I have to be original, I have to distance myself. Instead of saying, we are the same person, we have the same character, we have the same personality, we have the same qualities, the same interests. I can learn from you, you can learn from me. Or if it's an old master, I can learn from his paintings. That is some kind of a gratitude. So the whole art idea of originality is sort of this extremely egocentric, ungrateful, and quite cynical way of thinking. So if you can read Aristotle and understand the value of gratitude and the blessing of having someone like Rembrandt that you can learn from, it's then you start getting away from all those negative thoughts or bitterness because you have to be original.
So maybe this is something that he is a bit confused on, because he says on the one hand that friendship, true friendship, is actually when you share a part of your soul. I think it says literally that friendship is when you are one soul in two bodies, right? So you communicate very well, in other words.
That's very nice.
And that's real friendship. And my point is that he also says that you can't have that with an object that's not a person. And my point is that I think you can, to some extent. You can have a painting and you can study with Rembrandt, even though he's been dead for several hundred years. You can sort of be one soul in two different things with a painting or with a painter that's been dead. So I think there's room for a kind of friendship. It's a different kind, but it's a friendship in that sense, or a love in that sense, loving a relationship with an object.
Yeah, and you want to perpetuate those values,
and with
because
an
you have
activity,
so great love for them.
Yeah, and an activity, like the activity of painting. You can share your whole soul with that activity and say, I really want this activity to go well. And it's not my soul or my activity I want to go well, but that kind of activity I participate in.
And that presupposes that you are not an egocentric
you
person.
Can't be a narcissist here, because you will never get out of yourself. You need to go out of yourself to have a relationship of friendship or love with anything. Yeah. And I think it can be with objects, books. It relates back to the thing we talked about earlier about being less lonely when you read a good book or see a good painting. That's because you communicate and you share a part of your soul with that thing. Well, so I think it should have been more nuanced on this. I think Aristotle.
And implicitly, that's basically what it's saying when it comes to virtues too. You have a love relationship to those virtues, even though those are not persons.
Yeah, I mean, maybe. I'm not sure.
Would be the same relationship as to a painting.
Yeah. So virtues is sort of like attitudes you have, right?
But you
and
learn that they come
attitudes
externally.
Are praiseworthy. So you know that these attitudes are praiseworthy, then you can love them and like them and have kind of a relationship. Maybe,